Our life always seemed like a perfect fairy tale. We were the couple everyone envied. Constant support, trust, tenderness, and care for each other. Our mornings started with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, which we prepared together. We loved listening to our favorite music in the background and planning our day over a shared breakfast. Evenings were always filled with warmth, stargazing walks, long conversations, and laughter echoing through our home. We were what I called the dream team. No problem could break us. She wasn't just my love. She was the one who stood by me in the toughest times, motivated me, and inspired me. I truly believed our life was a story destined for a happy ending. But over time, I began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes. They were little things others might not have even noticed. But to me, they were signals that refused to let me rest. For instance, during our usual conversations, she started looking at her phone more often. She might smile in response, but her gaze was no longer as sincere and deep as it used to be. Her attention seemed scattered, as if her mind was elsewhere. One morning, as we were having breakfast together, her phone buzzed. She quickly glanced at the screen, and I noticed a change in her expression. It was just for a moment, but her smile suddenly disappeared. She quickly placed her phone face down, as if trying to hide something. I chuckled lightly and asked, "Who's that?" She looked at me with a hint of tension and replied, "Oh, it's nothing important." Then, she immediately changed the subject. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but at that moment, something inside me stirred uneasily. Why hadn't she just answered directly? What could have made her change the topic so quickly? That evening, we planned a romantic dinner at home. Candles flickered on the table, wine sparkled in our glasses. I was sharing plans for the future. Imagine, a year from now, we'll be somewhere on the ocean shore. Just imagine, warm sand, the sound of waves, and us as always together. She raised her glass with a smile, but her eyes were absent. "Yes, that sounds wonderful," she replied, but her words felt hollow. Then, she glanced at her phone lying next to her and quickly slipped it into her pocket. "Are you expecting something?" I asked, trying to mask my concern. "No, just work stuff," she replied briefly, avoiding eye contact. I felt something break inside me. Her behavior, her voice, even her movements, everything gave away that she was hiding something. But what? One night, after we had gone to bed, I woke up to the glow of her phone. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, engrossed in a text conversation. Her face was tense, and as soon as she noticed me looking, she quickly turned off the screen. "You're not sleeping?" I asked, trying to keep suspicion out of my voice. She smiled nervously. "Just work. Sorry, didn't mean to wake you." But this time, her voice was too soft, too calm, as if she were trying to reassure herself, not me. These little moments began to form a bigger picture. Whatever it was changing us, changing her. I started to feel an invisible wall growing between us, becoming taller with each passing day. But what was behind that wall? And would I have the strength to find out? At first, I tried to ignore it. We all get busy or tired sometimes, don't we? But day by day, these small changes became more noticeable. She used to always call me if she was running late at work. It was our simple way of showing care for each other. But lately, her calls became less frequent. At first, there were innocent explanations. The meeting ran late, or I decided to stay a bit longer to finish work. I trusted her, as I always did, but a sense of unease started creeping into my thoughts. One evening, she came home late when I was already half asleep. I heard the door open and her light footsteps down the hallway. "Sorry, it was a terrible day at work," she said without even looking at me. Her voice sounded so tired that I didn't press further. But the next morning, I noticed her bag left open, and inside was a receipt from a restaurant we had never visited together. Maybe she just had lunch with colleagues. I thought, trying to suppress the wave of jealousy and suspicion. But why hadn't she mentioned it? Then came more. She started going on sudden business trips. We used to discuss every trip, even the shortest ones. But now, everything had changed. I need to go to the neighboring city for 2 days. It's urgent, she said one morning as she prepared to catch a train. Her eyes seemed to avoid mine as she quickly kissed me on the cheek and left the house. What troubled me even more was her attachment to her phone. She started taking it everywhere, even to the bathroom. She used to leave it on the table or in the kitchen, but now it was always in her hand or pocket. I couldn't help but notice how she checked it every time a message came through, quickly locking the screen whenever I glanced her way. One evening, I decided to test her reaction. "What's so secretive on your phone?" I asked half-jokingly as we sat together on the couch. She smiled, but it was a strained smile. "It's just work stuff, nothing interesting," she said, immediately changing the subject. It was a small thing, but my mind had already started conjuring up the worst scenarios. What if she wasn't telling me the truth? What if these trips, delays, and calls were hiding something more? I tried convincing myself that it was just my paranoia. "You're overthinking," I told myself as I stared into the mirror. But the unease, the bitter sensation in my chest, wouldn't let me rest. I began noticing little things that hadn't seemed important before. Her perfume, for instance. She'd used the same scent for years, but recently she bought a new one. It wasn't unusual, but why now? Why was she suddenly putting extra care into choosing her outfits for work, even on days when, according to her, there were no important meetings? A storm of thoughts grew in my head. My imagination painted scenes I didn't want to see. Was she meeting someone? Or maybe she had problems she didn't want to talk about. But why keep it a secret? These thoughts ate away at me from the inside. And the worst part was I couldn't find answers. She remained as loving and attentive in the small things as ever, but I could no longer tell if it was genuine or just a mask to hide something deeper. Deep down, I knew the answers were close. But was I ready to hear them? It started with a small incident. I was helping her pack for yet another trip, a routine task for both of us. She'd always been a bit chaotic when it came to packing, scattering things around, forgetting little items. "Can you put my notebook and charger in the bag?" she called from another room. I instinctively picked up the notebook from the floor when I noticed a slip of white paper peeking out of a side pocket of her bag. Just a piece of paper, I thought, but something about it caught my attention. My rational mind said it was nothing, but my heart pounded as if anticipating a revelation. Carefully, I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a receipt from a restaurant. The name seemed familiar, but we had never been there together. My eyes scanned the details. The date 3 days ago, the time, late evening, almost 10 p.m. I tried to convince myself it was just a dinner with colleagues. But the restaurant was expensive, with the kind of red velvet booths and candlelit tables we had admired in brochures. Why did she go there? And why didn't she tell me? I reread the receipt, looking for something concrete. The dishes were refined. Salmon with creamy sauce, a $50 bottle of wine. This didn't seem like a work dinner. I carefully placed the receipt back into the pocket, trying not to disturb anything. She walked into the room a few minutes later, carrying her favorite makeup bag. "Oh, you're already done packing?" she asked cheerfully, not suspecting the storm raging in my mind as it screamed. "Ask her right now." But I just nodded and smiled. That evening, after she left, I couldn't calm down. Images played out in my head. She was at a table with a stranger, exchanging glances, laughing. But that couldn't be true, could it? The next day, another incident occurred. She left her phone on the kitchen counter while stepping into the bathroom. I walked by and saw the screen light up with a message. My heart skipped a beat. The message was short. "Thanks for last night." It was unforgettable. My hands shook. I glanced at the sender's name, a name I'd never seen in her contacts before. I tried to unlock the phone, but it was password protected. I didn't know the password, though we had always shared them before. When she returned, I watched her every move. She picked up the phone with a slight, almost imperceptible expression of relief. She didn't know I had seen the message. I wanted to ask her. I wanted to say outright, "Who is this? What's this about last night?" But something about her demeanor stopped me. She seemed so calm, so normal, that I doubted my suspicions for a moment. And yet I couldn't let it go. That evening, I decided to check the bag she'd left at home. I knew it was wrong, but my need for answers outweighed everything else. Inside were her usual belongings, makeup, a notebook, but at the bottom, I found another receipt. This time it was from a jewelry store. The date matched one of those days she was at a meeting. I sat on the bed with the receipt in my hands, trying to piece things together. Jewelry? For whom? For me? But if it was a surprise, why hadn't she said anything? The next day, I acted as if nothing had happened. But my heart pounded harder every time she picked up her phone or mentioned work. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something big, something that could change my life forever. But was I ready for what I might find? Every little detail now felt like evidence, every gesture a clue. Was I driving myself crazy? Or was I already seeing the truth, but too afraid to admit it? That evening, I couldn't hold it in any longer. All the little things, the restaurant receipt, the text message, the jewelry store, consumed my thoughts. I felt that if I didn't confront her now, these doubts would eat me alive. We were sitting at dinner. She seemed calm, even cheerful, as she talked about her day. Her voice sounded the same as always, but now every word felt suspect. I cleared my throat. "Can I ask you something?" I said, my voice steady but my heart racing. She looked up at me, her fork pausing midair. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I hesitated, looking into her eyes, searching for the truth. "Who's the person you've been texting so often? And why were you at that restaurant last week?" Her face froze. For a split second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, shock, fear, or guilt, but she quickly masked it with a calm expression. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone light but her hand trembling as she placed her fork down. I leaned forward. "I saw the message on your phone. I saw the receipt from the restaurant. Just tell me the truth, Mariah. I need to know." Her calm facade cracked. She looked down, avoiding my gaze. For the first time, I saw her as someone I didn't recognize, someone who had been hiding a part of herself from me. She sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "It's not what you think," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice breaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. "It's complicated," she said, but I didn't want complicated. I wanted the truth. I tried to start the conversation calmly. "How was your meeting yesterday?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. She gave me a quick glance, then returned to her plate. "Oh, fine. Nothing special," she replied almost absent-mindedly. I pretended to accept her answer, but continued. "What's this restaurant?" "The one on the receipt I found in your bag." This time she froze. Her fork stopped halfway to her plate, and for a moment, silence filled the room. Then she slowly placed the fork down and looked at me. Her eyes were cautious, but there was a certain coldness in them. "Were you going through my bag?" "No," I quickly replied. "It was an accident. I was just organizing your things." Her face tensed. She picked up her wine glass and took a sip before responding. "It was lunch with colleagues. I didn't think it was important enough to mention." Her words made sense, but something in her tone alarmed me. It was spoken too quickly, as if she had rehearsed the answer. "Colleagues?" I repeated, trying to sound casual. "Who exactly? Are you seriously asking me this right now?" Her voice suddenly rose, and she leaned back in her chair. "What's gotten into you? Why are you suddenly suspicious?" "Because you're hiding something." The words burst out of me before I could stop them. Her eyes flashed with irritation. She crossed her arms over her chest and retorted, "No, I'm not hiding anything. But you know what I see? I see that you've stopped trusting me." Those words hit me like a thunderbolt. All I wanted was answers, but now she was accusing me of not trusting her. "It's not about trust," I tried to explain. "It's just that your actions, they're not like you. You're always holding on to your phone. You're not sharing about your trips. Stop." She cut me off sharply. "Are you accusing me of something?" Her voice was cold, and the sharpness made me fall silent. I could see her face harden, and she put up a defensive expression. "No, I'm not accusing you," I said after a pause. "I just want to know the truth." She abruptly stood up and looked down at me. Her hands were trembling as she placed her napkin on the table. "You know what hurts me the most? Your willingness to think the worst of me." "I'm not thinking the worst of you." I tried to defend myself. "It's just that these little things, they seem strange." She shook her head and walked out of the room. I heard the bedroom door close behind her. I stayed at the table, feeling a mix of anger and guilt rising in my chest. She had avoided giving me an answer. Instead of clarity, I was now the one to blame for not trusting her. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She was lying beside me, but there was a gulf between us. Her back was turned to me, and I could hear her steady breathing. But was she really asleep? Or was she also feeling the rift that had grown between us? My mind was racing with questions. Her reaction had been too sharp, too defensive. What is she hiding? And am I ready to know the truth? After that conversation, I couldn't just sit idly anymore. Her evasive behavior, her sharp responses, and that coldness in her voice left me no choice. I knew that if I wanted to understand what was happening, I had to find the truth myself. That morning, when she left for work, I stayed home and began thinking about where to start. Her phone was always protected. A new password I didn't know. She kept it with her at all times, even while sleeping, leaving it face down on the nightstand. I decided that if her phone was inaccessible, I had to start with her social media. I opened her Facebook page and started scrolling through posts and comments. Nothing suspicious. Her profile was as perfect as our life had been a few months ago. Old vacation photos, shared pictures, sweet posts. But one recent post caught my eye. It was a photo of her at a corporate event. In the background, I noticed the figure of a man standing uncomfortably close to her, smiling warmly. I decided to dig further. On her Instagram, there was a photo captioned, "A beautiful day with wonderful company." Company? The picture only showed blurred shadows of other people, but no faces. Why was she choosing her words so carefully? My mind began to piece together scenarios. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the background. Who was he? And why did his face seem familiar? The next day, I decided to take it a step further. She said she'd be working late, and this was my chance. I left the house and drove to her office. The parking lot was almost empty, just a few cars. Her car was there, but the office building was dark. I froze, staring at the empty building with its dark windows. Her car was in its usual spot, but the building looked abandoned. Why would she say she was working late if there wasn't even a light on? My stomach twisted in knots as I realized I was standing on the edge of something that could change everything. I didn't know what I'd find, but I couldn't stop now. I began to survey the area, trying to find any clue. Suddenly, I saw her walking out of the neighboring cafe. She wasn't alone. The man from the photo was with her. They were talking about something, laughing. He leaned closer to her, as if saying something that made her smile. My head spun. This wasn't just a case of a colleague escorting a coworker. It was too intimate. She didn't even notice me watching from across the street. When I got home, I felt trapped. My hands trembled with anger. But deep inside, a part of me still wanted to find a rational explanation. I reviewed everything. Her behavior, the evidence I'd found, the scene outside the cafe. Every time, more details came together to form a clear picture. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I worked up the courage to take her phone. It was locked, but I decided to try some of the passwords she'd used before. After a few attempts, the screen unlocked. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her messages. What I saw hit me like a lightning bolt. Her conversation with that man. They discussed meetings, shared some secrets. One of the messages read, "That evening was perfect. I hope we can do it again." I threw the phone onto the table, feeling my blood boil. Everything I'd seen and heard over the past few weeks now formed one clear story. But was I ready to confront her about it? Could I bring myself to say it all out loud? When she came out of the bathroom, I was sitting on the couch, trying to look calm. She smiled as she always did and asked, "What's wrong? You seem a bit lost in thought today." I looked at her, trying to hide my pain and anger. Inside me, a storm was raging, but on the surface, I remained as cold as ice. "Nothing, just a lot on my mind," I replied. Now I knew exactly what I had to do. But how far was I willing to go to uncover the whole truth? And would that truth destroy me once I found it? I never thought I'd see it with my own eyes. All my suspicions, all those small discoveries and unexplained moments could have just stayed in my head. But that day changed everything. It was an ordinary weekday. She said she'd be working late because of a new project at the office. I decided to take a walk to clear my head from all the thoughts that had been consuming me lately. But I had no idea that this walk would change everything. I was walking down the street when I noticed a familiar figure in the window of a cafe. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, someone who looked like her. But the closer I got, the clearer the silhouette became. It was her. She was sitting at a table by the window. Across from her sat a man, and I recognized him immediately. It was the same man from the photos from her messages. They were both leaning toward each other as if sharing something important. Her face was relaxed, and she was smiling. That same smile I once thought was only for me. My heart felt like it stopped for a second. I couldn't believe my own eyes. All the sounds around me faded, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. My head was filled with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them gave me any answers. I stood across the street, hiding behind a parked car. From a distance, I could see him saying something, and she laughed in response. Then he leaned closer to her, and their faces were far too close for it to be innocent. I felt a surge of anger rising in my chest, but along with it came disappointment. Was this it? Was this the moment I lost her forever? I tried to find an explanation, an excuse for this, but nothing could erase what I'd just witnessed. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos through the window. I didn't know why I was doing it. Maybe I wanted proof to show her later. Maybe it was my subconscious trying to capture the moment when everything changed. At that moment, they stood up from their seats. He grabbed her coat and helped her put it on. She nodded in thanks, and they walked out of the cafe together. I stepped back, hiding behind the car, and watched them walk down the street side by side. Their movements were light, effortless. They seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. I stood there for a few more minutes, unable to move. Shock, pain, anger, they all blended into one overwhelming wave that consumed me. My heart was pounding out of my chest, and my mind desperately searched for answers. Why was she doing this? Why was she hiding it from me? Was this betrayal? Or was there an explanation I just couldn't see? I went home, but I kept replaying the scene in my head. Her smile, her glances, her movements. She wasn't the person I thought I knew, and yet she was still her. My head was spinning with thoughts. When she came home late that evening, everything looked as it always did. She smiled at me and said, "Sorry for being so late. There was just too much work." Her voice sounded sincere. Her eyes looked right at me, but I could no longer believe her. "How was your day?" she asked, sitting down next to me. I did everything to hide my anxiety and pain. "It was fine, just a little tired," I said, avoiding her gaze. All I wanted in that moment was to ask her directly, "Who is he? Why were you with him? But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Something told me I needed more proof, more clarity to fully uncover the truth. Now I understood that there was no turning back. My trust had been shattered, and I had to find the answers, no matter how bitter they might be. I could no longer keep it inside. All those moments that once seemed insignificant now formed a picture that screamed betrayal. The restaurant receipt, the message, the meeting at the cafe, all of it left no room for doubt. It was time to uncover the truth. That evening, I sat in the living room, waiting for her to return. The lights were dim, and the silence in the room was deafening. I looked at the photograph of the two of us on the shelf. It had been taken years ago when we had just moved into this house. We looked so happy, so genuine. Now, it all felt like a lie. The door finally opened, and she stepped into the room. Her face bore a tired smile, but I noticed her eyes briefly scanning mine, as if trying to gauge what I was feeling. "You're home early today," she said, shrugging off her coat. "How was your day?" I looked at her. Everything I had been trying to hide now spilled out. I couldn't play the role anymore. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though a storm raged inside me. She stopped halfway to the kitchen. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than usual. Then she slowly nodded. "All right, what do you want to talk about?" she asked, sitting across from me. I didn't beat around the bush. All I wanted was answers. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I had taken outside the cafe. Her face froze for a moment. "Who is he?" I asked, looking her straight in the eyes. Her reaction was unexpected. She didn't deny it or try to justify herself. Instead, she leaned back on the sofa and covered her face with her hands. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice quiet but tinged with nervous tension. "Then explain it to me," I replied, "because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're spending time with someone I don't even know." She removed her hands from her face and looked at me. Her eyes glistened as if she were on the verge of tears. "It's Robert," she finally said. "He's my colleague." "A colleague?" I repeated, feeling anger rising in my throat again. "What kind of colleague takes you to dinner at a restaurant and spends evenings with you at a cafe?" She averted her gaze, as if searching for the right words. Then she sighed and said, "He's helping me with some personal matters." "Personal matters? What kind of personal matters?" My voice was louder than I intended. She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I didn't expect. It wasn't guilt or fear. It was something else. "It's about my brother," she said. I was shocked. I hadn't heard about her brother in years. She rarely mentioned him after they had a falling out. "Your brother?" I asked, trying to process what she had just said. "And what does Robert have to do with him?" She hesitated before replying. "My brother is in big trouble. I can't tell you everything, but Robert is a lawyer. He's helping me resolve the situation." I sat there, looking at her, trying to decide if she was telling the truth. Her face seemed sincere, but why had she kept it from me? "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, feeling my frustration turning into sadness. "Because I didn't want to drag you into this," she replied. "It's a complicated story, and I thought I could handle it on my own." Her words sounded logical, but something still felt off. "Is that all?" I asked. "Is there anything else you're not telling me?" She fell silent for a moment, then quietly said, "There's one more thing, but I can't talk about it yet." Her words felt like a blow. What else was she hiding? Why did she continue to keep me in the dark? I couldn't speak anymore. I got up and walked to the bedroom, leaving her sitting on the sofa. Her final words kept echoing in my mind. "There's one more thing." What was it? And was I ready to face the truth? After that confrontation, silence filled the house. We barely spoke, avoided long conversations, but I could see that something was eating away at her. Her eyes were filled with sadness. Her movements seemed restrained. She no longer resembled the person I once knew. All I could do was watch as the wall between us grew taller and thicker. Now I understood that there was no turning back. My trust had been shattered, and I had to find the answers, no matter how bitter they might be. That evening, when she went to the store, I stayed home. I sat on the couch, looking at my phone where the photos from the cafe were still saved. Every time I looked at them, I felt a mix of anger and pain. But now another emotion had joined them, doubt. Her words about her brother and the lawyer sounded sincere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the whole truth. That evening, I decided to act. She had left her laptop open on the kitchen table. I hesitated for a few seconds, but then I sat down and opened it. I had a bad feeling, but at the same time, I wanted to understand what was really going on. As I browsed through her emails, I found one with a subject line that immediately caught my attention. Robert. Case regarding Mikhailu. Mikhailu was her brother. I clicked on the email and began to read. It contained details about a legal case. Her brother was in serious trouble. He was being accused of financial fraud and faced several years in prison. Robert, the man I had seen her with, really was a lawyer and was helping her organize his defense. It wasn't just an email. It included attachments, court documents, witness lists, and other details she had been keeping hidden from me. I went through it all with a growing sense of guilt settling deep inside me. When she returned, I was sitting in the living room, holding the printed email. She saw me and froze. "Did you read it?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with exhaustion. I nodded, not taking my eyes off her. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep this from me?" She sighed and sat down beside me. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. "Because I didn't want to drag you into this," she said. "I know how you feel about him. You've always thought he's nothing but trouble, and I was afraid you wouldn't support me." Her words hit me like a knife. She was right. I had always criticized her brother, always seen him as irresponsible and careless. But I had no idea what she was going through. "That's not a reason to keep the truth from me," I said, trying to stay calm. "We could have dealt with this together." She looked at me, and I saw the same love in her eyes that had always been there. "I didn't want to burden you. I knew you had your own worries, and I didn't want to add to them." Her words stung. I felt guilty that she had felt the need to face this alone. "Robert is just helping me find a way out. I couldn't have managed without him." "But that doesn't mean I'm drifting away from you," she added, her voice trembling. I placed the email on the table and took her hand. "You don't have to do this alone. We're a team, remember?" She lowered her head, and I felt tears rolling down her cheeks. This was the moment when the truth finally surfaced between us. The secret that had been tearing our relationship apart wasn't infidelity, but a desperate attempt to protect someone she loved. I felt a wave of relief wash over my anger, but with it came a deep sense of guilt. How could I have thought the worst of her? How could I have let my suspicions overshadow the love I'd always felt for her? That night marked the beginning of a new chapter for us. We sat together, talked, and cried. I finally realized how much I didn't know about her life, her struggles, and her fears. But the most important thing I realized was that our relationship needed trust more than ever. The truth wasn't what I had feared. It was more complex, but it was also pure. And now, with everything laid bare, I felt that we could start again, stronger than before. The following days after everything became clear were strange. I felt relieved that we had finally talked, but the guilt for doubting her still weighed on me. She was there, as always, but now her behavior seemed more open. She talked about her brother, the difficulties he was facing, and how Robert was helping her navigate the legal complexities. We even started spending more time together again, like we used to. I began to think that our relationship was finally returning to normal. And although her brother remained a difficult topic for me, I tried my best to support her. One evening, after she had already fallen asleep, I sat in the living room watching TV. My phone buzzed, and I saw a message. It was from an anonymous number. The message contained only one sentence. Do you really know what she's up to? My heart froze. Was this a joke? Or something more? I tried calling the number, but it was switched off. That message left me feeling uneasy. All my doubts, which I thought had been resolved, suddenly came rushing back. I forced myself not to react impulsively, telling myself it might just be someone's cruel prank. But the next morning, something else happened. She had left her laptop open as she got ready for work. As I passed by, I noticed an open document. It looked like a simple to-do list, but at the bottom of the document, I saw a line. Meeting with R at 9 p.m., Grand View Hotel. My mind raced. Why was she meeting Robert at a hotel? And why hadn't she told me? The uneasy feeling from the previous night returned with full force. It was clear that, despite everything, I still didn't know the full truth. I sat staring at that line, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was related to her brother again. Maybe Robert wanted to discuss something in private. But why a hotel? That evening, I decided to act. I didn't tell her I knew about the meeting, but I drove to the hotel to see for myself if anything suspicious was happening. I parked in the lot outside the entrance, trying to remain unnoticed. At 8:55 p.m., I saw her walk into the hotel. She looked tense, glancing around as if making sure no one saw her. A few minutes later, Robert walked in. They exchanged a few words in the lobby before taking the elevator to the upper floors. My heart raced. I couldn't just sit and watch. Something about this felt wrong. I got out of the car and entered the hotel. At the reception, I said I was looking for a friend and managed to learn the room number they had gone to. When I reached the door, I could hear voices. They were speaking quietly, but I caught fragments of their conversation. It's too risky. If he finds out, it could ruin everything. My breath caught. She was hiding something. I composed myself and knocked on the door. Inside, there was silence. A few seconds later, the door opened, and there she was. Her face turned pale when she saw me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice strained. "That's what I want to ask you," I replied, looking her directly in the eyes. Robert stepped closer to the door, his expression emotionless, but there was something in his gaze that unsettled me. "We need to talk," I said, focusing on her. She sighed and gestured for me to come inside. On the table were documents they had been reviewing. I recognized some. They were legal papers, but among them was something else, a black envelope with my name on it. "What's this?" I asked, pointing at the envelope. She stayed silent. Robert glanced at her, as if waiting for her to answer. "I was going to tell you about it," she finally said. "I just didn't know how." I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside were documents about our property, bank accounts, and even insurance policies. It turned out she was planning to transfer everything into a separate trust. But why? "I'm doing this for us," she said, but her voice carried uncertainty, as though she didn't fully believe her own words. This moment left me with more questions than answers. What was she truly planning? Was this her final secret? Or was there something even bigger lurking in the shadows? The days after. The next few days passed in a haze. I couldn't understand why she had hidden all this for so long. The documents, the envelope with my name, her explanation about protecting our future, it didn't seem enough to dispel the weight of suspicion I carried. She started acting as though everything was normal, returning to her usual routines. But I couldn't ignore the signs. Something was wrong. Her gaze was different. There was something in her eyes I couldn't identify, but I felt it was tied to something far bigger than I imagined. One evening, after she had fallen asleep, I decided to check her phone. She had left it on the nightstand, and this time I took the chance. I unlocked it using a password she had previously used. To my surprise, it worked. Her phone was almost empty. No messages from Robert, no traces of conversations or notes. But among her apps was one she had never used before, a voice message storage app. I opened it and found just one message, sent a few days ago. The sender was simply labeled as R. I hesitated before listening. My heart pounded, and my hands trembled as I pressed play. Robert's calm, cold voice filled the silence of the room. We can't delay this any longer. If he finds out, it could ruin everything. You need to decide if the risk is worth continuing. I've tried to help you, but now it's your decision. My heart stopped. What was he talking about? What decision? What were they planning? While I was processing what I'd just heard, another message came through on her phone. It was from the same anonymous number that had messaged me before. It contained just one sentence. You've only seen part of the story. Ready to learn the truth? At that moment, I heard her stir in bed. I quickly locked the phone and placed it back on the nightstand, trying to act as if nothing had happened. She turned slightly toward me, her eyes half open. "What are you doing?" she asked sleepily. "Nothing, just couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to mask my fear and anxiety. She closed her eyes and drifted off again, but I couldn't calm down. Everything I thought I knew now seemed like just the tip of the iceberg. I sat in the dark, holding my head in my hands, trying to figure out what to do next. All these pieces of the story weren't fitting together. I knew there was still something she wasn't telling me. But what? The camera closes in on my face. The face of a man standing at the edge of truth and fear. The light from the phone lying beside me suddenly lights up again, revealing a new message. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., you'll understand everything. The light fades, leaving me in darkness with new questions and a growing sense of dread. What awaits me tomorrow? And am I ready to face what's hidden in the shadows?